Cheney of Gen X Quilters and the author of Sister Sampler Quilts. We've put together a series of video tutorials for you on some basic quilting techniques to help get you started if you're a beginner or if you're a more advanced quilter but need a little refresher that will hopefully help you out when you're starting new projects and need some inspiration. Today we're going to talk about binding. You are so close, you're this close, you're like 90% done with your project, and now it's time to bind your quilt. There's several ways to do binding, but I'm going to show you my favorite method today. The method is called straight grain, continuous, double folded binding with mitered corners. That is a mouthful. It's really not that complicated. Straight grain just means when we cut our binding strips, we're going to cut with the grain of the fabric instead of across the fibers. So we're just going to cut strips from selvage to selvage edge. So that's easy. Straight grain, continuous. The continuous part of the binding just means we're going to start and stop in the same place. And then when you're finished, you won't be able to tell where that location was. Straight grain, continuous, double fold. Double fold means that we're going to fold the pieces over in half. So then you'll have 2 layers of fabric protecting your quilt on the binding. Makes it extra sturdy. And then we'll finish off each corner with a mitered corner. So it sounds complicated, but it's really not. We just need to put all of those elements together as we're finishing off our quilt. So as I mentioned, to get started, we need to cut our binding strips. Now you'll start with just regular yardage, and you'll want to decide how wide you would like your strips. It's kind of the convention to use 2.5-inch wide strips, although if that doesn't suit your fancy, you can always change that once you've done some quilts and you can see, well, I really want a thicker binding or a thinner binding. But most people end up using 2.5, so that's what I've cut here. So you'll cut your strips just from selvage to selvage, and then make sure you remove those selvages before you get started. I've already done that ahead of time. Now to make it all the way around your quilt, you might have to join several strips together. I'm going to show you how I join them. Usually I lay one of them parallel to myself and put the other one perpendicular at the edge of the first strip. Now we're going to join them by sewing on the diagonal. So sometimes it's easy to get confused which diagonal you might need to sew on. So we're just going to kind of flip it over, and if we sew on the diagonal, you just want to make sure that the strips will end up being in alignment when you open them up. Now since this is a solid, there really is no right or wrong side. If you had a printed fabric, you would want to make sure that you had your right sides together in this technique. But so I'm just going to kind of finger press a line in here for myself to sew on. So you'll see I'll sew on that line, and again I'm just going to flip it over to make sure that the 2 strips will be in alignment with each other after I've sewn. So we'll just stick a pin in there. Like that. Okay. Now I'll take it over to my machine to sew. When you're working with binding, you always want to use your walking foot if you have one. A walking foot has feed dogs on the top, so it will help you feed all of the layers of your quilt and the binding through your machine a lot easier. So if you have one of those, I would definitely use it when you're working on binding. So we're just going to sew along that diagonal that we pressed. To join our 2 strips together. Okay, so here's what they look like when you take them out after you sew them. Yep, we did it correctly, so they're in alignment. If you sew on the wrong diagonal, they won't end up in a straight line. So now this part over here is excess, so we're just going to trim that off. And we want to trim that about 1/4 inch away from our stitching. And that fabric is waste. Now, I'm just going to join 2 of these strips together to show you, but if you're doing a large quilt, you might have several strips to join. So if you needed that, then I would do that all at this point in time, do all of the sewing before I moved over to press my seam open. But in this case, I'm just going to show you this one for an example. Now this is the one place where I like to press my seams open. It will reduce the bulk of the seam at this point when you fold your binding over. So just give that a quick press. And now you're ready to create the double fold. So in this case, if we had printed fabric, you would want to put your wrong sides together so that the right side of the fabric is on the outside of your binding. We'll fold these strips in half and press them together. You want to do that for the whole length of your binding strip. So sometimes this could take a while if you have a large quilt. I've gone ahead and prepared another strip that's the right length. Kind of is a little cheating. This one is ready to go and put on my quilt sandwich. So here's the sandwich I have for my quilt. Here's the right side, although I didn't do any piecing, it's just plain fabric. And here's the back. In this first technique I'm going to show you, we're going to stitch the binding on by hand. That means we will start with machine stitching on the front and then we'll flip it over and bind it by hand onto the back. So we'll take our binding strip and you want to place the raw edges of your binding strip in alignment with the raw edges of your quilt. I'll stick a pin in here right at the beginning. And then I'd like to take another pin and pin it maybe 6 to 8 inches down through the sandwich. You can continue pinning along here. If you had a really big quilt or a long edge that you needed to sew on, you can continue pinning. But really, I just want to show you these two pins at the front. The very front will keep the beginning edge of your binding tacked down to your quilt top, but we're not going to start sewing until that second pin. The reason we want to do this is we want to leave some free space at the beginning so that after we've sewn all the way around the rectangle, we come back to the beginning, we're going to join the free end of the beginning with the free end of the end. So that just kind of reminds you not to start sewing all the way at the very edge. Okay, so now that I'm ready to sew, put this in here and start sewing at our second pin. You want to back stitch at the beginning. Okay, now we'll hold the binding in place, kind of move along the edge, making sure to keep sewing with a 1/4 inch seam. Okay, you want to sew all the way up and stop about a 1/4 inch away from the edge of your sandwich. That looks about right. You can lock stitch there or back stitch if you need to. Okay, then we'll take it out of the machine. We're going to turn the corner. Okay, this is where we create our mitered corner. Okay, so we have our binding strip here. Right now it's coming down towards my body. What you want to do is finger press a 90-degree seam in here, right at that corner. So we're going to fold, finger press that corner for the miter, and then make sure that the strip is folded away from your quilt sandwich. Then we're going to double back on top of itself, just like this, to create that mitered corner. And now your binding has its raw edges back in alignment with the raw edges of the quilt sandwich. We should pin that fold so that it stays in place. Okay, we'll stick another pin in here for good measure, even though this is a short side. And now we can continue sewing along this edge just as we did the first side with a 1/4 inch seam. Okay, there's a lot of fabric here at the beginning, so make sure you go slowly to push all the layers through. Take that pin out when I get there. And then just continue sewing. We'll do the same thing along all the other corners. Okay, so here we are, we're coming around back to the beginning of our quilt, or the beginning where we started binding. And as you can see, we have this loose portion from the beginning where we started sewing, and then we have this free end that we need to cut to size. So now to make it continuous, we need to get this length to be the proper length. And what we need to do is to take the ending binding strip that's too long, and we'll take and butt it up right up against where the fabric begins for the binding, right here. Fold it back on top of itself. Now we're going to need to trim this, and the distance that you want to trim it back is the width of your binding strip. So at the beginning, I mentioned that our binding strips were 2.5 inches wide. So that's the amount that I should measure back and trim at. If you changed your binding strip width, you would want to change whatever that dimension is. So if your binding strips are only 2 inches wide, you would want to cut this at 2 inches long. So let's see, I'll place this. Let's see if this is an easy way to see here. So you can see we can count 1, 2, 2.5 inches, and that's the location where I will trim it. I don't want to cut through my other layers, so I got to be careful when I trim this. Trim 1, 2, 2.5, right here. We'll trim it right across. There. Now this is excess that we don't need. And we're ready to join these pieces into one continuous strip. So now this is why you need a little bit of room here with the leaving the gap at the beginning and at the end, is because we're going to have to join these just like we did at the beginning, but then all of our binding was free. We didn't have it attached to the quilt. So I want to take these, kind of open up our strips. Again, we need to do right sides together. I know that's a little bit difficult to see with the solid binding, but we'll do right sides together. Pin those pieces in place. And we're going to sew along that diagonal, so I'm kind of going to finger press that line in here to join the strips. Okay, so now we'll take this back. It's a little bit awkward, but that's why we left this part free. We'll want to sew on that diagonal line that we finger pressed to join the last of the strips. Sometimes the quilt pulls it a little bit, so you got to make sure that these pieces are perpendicular to each other. But there. Let's see, did it work? Sometimes it's easy to get these twisted. But there, that's correct. So now we have to trim off the excess, and we did this at the beginning with our rotary cutter, but since everything's attached to the quilt, I'm just going to go ahead and do this with my scissors. Makes it a little easier that way. So that's scrap. We'll go over here and press this seam open so that it lays nice and flat when we enclose it in the binding. There. So press that seam open, and then we'll continue folding it in half. Just give that a quick press so it lays nicely. There. Now we'll go back and finish attaching this end that's free to the quilt. We'll just finish off the remaining free part. Always want to lock stitch or back stitch when we start and stop. The binding is what's going to hold the whole quilt together. Let's see. Okay, now I got a little pinch in there, probably because I'm a little nervous doing it on camera, but normally you wouldn't have a pinch there. And then you can't tell where you started and stopped. Here's the place where we joined the beginning and the ending of our binding. When you go ahead and fold this all over, you're not going to be able to tell. So this is the top. We machine sewed it to the top of the quilt. And now we need to finish up the back. So we'll turn it over. And this is the part where you sew by hand. So before I get to the corner, I'm just going to trim off a little bit of the bulk in here. Make sure you don't cut into your stitching. And then this is where you can use the binding clips. These are special binding clips. You can also use hair barrettes. I've done that for plenty of years to hold the binding in place. You kind of want to fold it over so that you're covering the stitching line here. You want to make sure that that stitching line is covered. And actually, normally I would use thread that is, a much closer color to the fabrics that you're using, but so that you could see it on the demo, I'm obviously using something that stands out so you can see where it's at. So this we would want to do around the entire quilt. Then when you get to that corner, you can fold it up so it meets at that stitching line, and then fold over your miter. You can put a little binding clip right there on the corner. Now, this is the part that so many people find so relaxing and soothing. So you get your quilt, put all your binding clips on, go sit on the couch, sit by the fire, put on a good movie, and do some hand sewing. So let's see, I'll start here so that hopefully I can show you a couple stitches as we get to the corner. Now this guy we kind of want to tuck underneath the binding, hide him there. And we'll kind of want to disguise this. So then I'll stick my needle back into the back of the quilt at the same place that I entered my stitch and pull it on through. And again, I would normally use brown thread here, the same color thread as the binding, but I'm hoping you'll be able to see the stitches a little bit better if I'm using the white. So then we just continue like this. I usually make my stitches, I don't know, about 1/4 inch apart. And then when you get to the corner, you just want to tack that with a couple of extra stitches. Added 2 or 3, put it through the first time. And then I usually tack in an extra stitch or 2 just to make sure it's extra sturdy. And again, normally you'll use thread that blends, so you won't see those. So this takes a while. I have another sample here that's already finished. There. So you can see what it looks like when you hand stitch all the way around. You can't tell where you stopped and where you started. There's just these little lines here that show where the binding strips are joined. And that would be it. That's the end of your binding, and your quilt is done. Just make sure you put a label on it, right? So that's stitching by hand. I have another method I want to show you that is doing your binding all as stitching by machine. I almost always bind all my quilts by machine. It's sturdier. I feel like my hand stitching is a little more susceptible to damage. I have 3 active boys that like to abuse all of the quilts that I make and make forts out of them, so I always machine stitch everything so that it's really holding in there. And that way it doesn't take as much time, because hand binding, while it's great and soothing, most of the time I don't have time to spend all of that time binding quilts. So I really like this machine method. In this method, when you bind by machine, instead of starting and putting the binding all around, and I've made my continuous strip here, you start on the back of the quilt. Okay? So in the hand binding demo, I stitched the binding to the front of the quilt, and then we folded it over and hand stitched on the back. In this case, we stitch it by machine to the back of the quilt and fold over to the front. So again, we'd use our binding clips. Kind of hold that in place. Make it around a corner. We can do that all the way around. Let me just put on an extra one or two here. So now we're going to do this all by machine. Again, you always want to use your walking foot when you're sewing by machine. Kind of stick this up underneath here, and you want to make sure that you're folded over that stitching mark. And we'll use a top stitch. So you want to sew pretty close to the edge of the binding, like 1/8 of an inch away, and I usually bring it down to kind of test it out before I drop my needle. There. And then this time we'll go ahead and secure that with a back stitch at the beginning, but we'll want to use this careful 1/8 inch top stitch all the way around the quilt. Now you may be thinking, yeah, I have to sew slow in order to sew such a top stitch so close to the edge of the binding, but I guarantee you it's faster than doing this by hand. So that's what I like. I like speedy. Okay, as we approach the corner, kind of slow down, make sure everything's in alignment. Okay, let me move this binding clip out of the way to make sure that you can see. So now we have our mitered corner folded, and you kind of want to just hold that in place with your fingers, and you'll sew up until the place where the binding intersects at the corner. Do one more. There. Then you keep your needle down, lift your presser foot up, and turn your quilt 90 degrees so you're ready to sew along the next edge. And then you continue all the way around the quilt. You'll do each corner in the same method. And again, I've cheated, and I have a little sample ready to go. So here's the front of your quilt. Again, you would normally use a yellow thread in here, so it will blend nicely, but you can see here how you pivot at the corners and you sew that nice top stitch all along the edge. Now, one thing that a lot of people don't like about the machine binding is that you can see the stitching on the back. You can see here, sometimes it jumps up onto the binding, other times it's off in the quilt, on the back, off in the quilt. That's something that doesn't bother me. I don't mind it. You can use and choose threads that blend nicely, but it's a nice way to finish quilts, and it has a very durable and sturdy finish. So there you have it, 2 different ways to bind your quilts, and I hope you find one that works for you. Thank you.